Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 6th, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And this week, we are going to dive in with Dr. Sarah Olson from the Wildlife Conservation Society. But before we do that, I want to thank those of you who continue to support Talk Nerdy week after week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because the show really does rely on the support of listeners just like you. You make it possible to offset the cost, to make sure that you fund the expense behind making the show each week so that nobody is forced to pay to listen. This week's top patrons are Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Rob Schreck, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, David J.E. Smith, Dudas Infinitus, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, and Ulrika Hagman. And if you're interested in supporting the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/Talk Nerdy, and you can pledge your support. Any amount over $2 actually gets you an ad-free version of the show. All right, so let's talk about what is going on this week. So as I mentioned, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Sarah Olson. She is actually the director of the Wildlife Conservation Society Health Program, and she specifically focuses, on a lot of things, but specifically on emerging zoonotic pathogens. So she studies bats here in North America and across the globe. She's looked at white nose syndrome. She's looked at Ebola virus. And also, of course, the Wildlife Conservation Society is looking at coronaviruses, including SARS-CoV-2. In addition to wildlife trafficking, the kind of global wildlife trade, and how all of these different things contribute to, potential pandemics, global warming, environmental degradation. All of these things are related, and we're going to dive deep into that. So without further ado, let's have her take it away, Dr. Sarah Olson. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here with you today, Cara.
I am excited to talk about, excited. Yes, I am excited to talk to you today, but I'm also, wary and interested yet concerned about, the work that you do, especially on zoonotic pathogens, on emerging infections, and on sort of the relationship between humans and animals and species and other species that wouldn't usually come into contact in the wild, and how that can sort of lead to exactly what we've been experiencing within these past couple of years, pandemics and, everything in between. So I don't know, there's so much to dive into. You specifically focus on bats, right? Is that one of the bigger sort of species that you tend to spend time on, is is North American bats?
I focus on a couple of different species when it comes to bats. I do a little bit of work both in North America, and we have a program in Republic of Congo where we've been working on fruit bats there and the potential of these species to potentially harbor Ebola viruses. So that work goes back to 2011, and then working across being based in WCS, a conservation organization, coming to this question with a conservation lens. So we work also on wildlife trade and this issue as well, thinking a lot about how landscape and land use change can increase zoonotic disease spillover risks. And so I touch on a couple different aspects of this problem. And yes, we are all very weary at this stage with COVID-19 going on, and trying to continue to do this work, which WCS has been doing and leading on going back to the early 2000s.
So white nose syndrome here in the US, Ebola potentially in bats you said in the DRC, right? And then also, work even about what's going on with COVID. How did COVID get started? How is it spreading? Where are its natural reservoirs? all of this is, as you mentioned, from a conservation lens because of your work with the Wildlife Conservation Society. Before we dive into your specific work, I'm curious how you sort of got to where you are now. Like, what did you study in school? What was your specialty to kind of get you into this place where, this is your research?
That's a great question. I have been fortunate to, just have been brought up, I think, with a curious mind raised by teachers. And so I did an undergraduate in microbiology with a strong interest in doing a lot of lab-based research, lab bench research, and came out of that, not sure where I was going, but tried out Peace Corps and teaching before I jumped, fully into a more academic line of work, and came back from that really interested in thinking more about population health. And the growing field at that time was called eco-health, where you're bringing together environment, human, and wildlife. And it's kind of merged now into a bigger, other names, One Health or planetary health, but really thinking about optimizing the health of all living things on the planet is the end goal. And getting out a little bit out of the traditional environmental health work, which, is water and sanitation, air quality, and things like that. And I was really compelled to kind of dive into that space, and I was fortunate to do a PhD on deforestation and malaria in University of Wisconsin, and looking at the connections of how deforestation alters mosquito habitats and it shifts, which mosquito species are in the Amazon. And it kind of was a springboard from that into my postdoc with WCS, where I had, kind of done my homework on environment and my homework on human health. And I was seeing this as an opportunity to get my feet wet. And here I am, completely submerged in all things wildlife conservation. And I can't bring myself to leave. So a diverse kind of, career trajectory, but really really thankful to have arrived where I am and to be in a place where hopefully we can, move in the right direction when it comes to One Health and conservation.
Yeah, it's interesting, this concept you mentioned of One Health, of this sort of like global perspective on health, because I think so often, I don't know if this is a Western perspective. I don't know if this is an American perspective. I don't even know if this is the dominant perspective, but at least here in the US, what I observe is very much a short-sightedness about, well, how does this affect me? And if it doesn't affect me, I'm not sure I'm terribly interested. And it sounds to me like you're taking a much more global lens of how do all of these different conservation issues affect not only human beings globally, but also the ecology of the individual species.
Yeah, it's a big space, and we need more. We need more expertise and people getting into this field. It is about climate change. It's about social justice. It's about biodiversity loss, and the foundations of what make life possible, right? Like the health of wildlife, the health of plants on Earth is what makes our economies run. And so it does come full circle, and it is hard to make that connection if you are just going about your day and seeing those bigger forces. But it is about living sustainably on this planet and living, for the future generations, so they have just as many resources as we enjoy today. And it comes full circle to thinking about, what are the trade-offs? How do we live sustainably with these constraints and preserving the biodiversity that we have? So big challenges and small steps. Hopefully, I kind of I don't want to get too tied up in the vastness of the challenges we face, but to kind of break it down and to find ways we can make progress across all of these issues.
Yeah, and truth be told, these issues are really all interconnected. So when we talk about climate change, global climate change, when we talk about deforestation, when we talk about, other examples of environmental degradation, this is directly connected to things like zoonotic spillover, to things like, pandemics, global pathogens, all of these things that we think of as sort of being separate issues really speak to one another, because so much of it has to do with, I guess, human intervention, human action without a thought of the ramifications, without a thought of how, my clearing this forest or pouring this concrete or building, these structures is affecting the wildlife and the biodiversity that used to exist in that place.
Yeah, there's a colleague of mine, Craig Stevens, who calls the situation we're in interproblemary. Like there's all these
Mm-hmm.
problems are interconnected, and then there in recognizing that there's hope that if we can bring kind of multi-sectoral approaches, recognizing that these problems are not just siloed, they span wildlife, people, ecosystems, and livestock. That we can, navigate towards solutions that are inter-solutionary, I guess is another way to think about it.
Yeah,
But yeah, it is challenging space.
absolutely. And it sounds like, as you mentioned, even small steps, even, the cool thing, I guess you could say about this space, which is so challenging and feels so huge and feels in many ways insurmountable, is that we sort of know a lot of things that could be done. We're just not doing them. And so, I mean, we are doing plenty of things as well, obviously, but there's so many more things that we could be doing that it seems like there is room for growth. There's room for improvement. There's room for solutions within this space. And, step by step, piecemeal by piecemeal, like we really can affect change.
And that's one thing. The other aspect of One Health is an approach. It's an approach to bring people together, people working on wildlife, people working on livestock issues, people thinking about climate change, and to bring everybody into the same space and to approach these issues from these different perspectives and figure out where the wins are.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the research that you do. As I'm actually looking at some of your published articles, I made a mistake early on when I was sort of trying to summarize where you've been focusing, and I said the DRC, but it's actually in Congo Brazzaville, right, where you've been doing some of this research on Ebola.
Yeah, there's two Congos, and
Hmm.
you don't want to fly to the wrong one. You
Yeah,
want to make
exactly. Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, yeah. So there's the DRC, which is where Kinshasa is, and then on the other side of the border, it's the Republic of Congo. Sometimes, yeah, kind of colloquially referred to as Congo Brazzaville, because that's the major city there. And so you've been doing research. It looks like with colleagues in Congo Brazzaville, with colleagues across here in the U.S. and even in Germany, looking at this idea of, where is Ebola hanging out? Because we know that Ebola is one of these viral infections that we cannot eradicate. It's not like polio, because it has natural reservoirs. It's hanging out in nature. It's existing in animals, and it takes a spillover event for it to sort of induce either a very small epidemic or hopefully not anything larger. Um, but we're going to keep seeing it pop up, right? So we need to understand what these animal reservoirs are.
Yeah. The animal reservoirs are the ones that trigger these initial outbreaks. There is some new, really crazy work that's being done on how humans can maybe harbor the virus after these outbreaks, and that those can, trigger subsequent outbreaks. And that's what's maybe been happening. The most recent outbreaks, like in the last year,
Oh,
are being
really?
traced back to
Interesting.
some of these cases where people have harbored the virus and then triggered a new outbreak once, it kind of, the body kind of packages that viruses into a small corner and somehow it breaks out. But yeah, my work is more in the space of that spillover from wildlife to people, and with this research, we're really focused on building kind of a long-term study in a site where we can readily access one species of bats where we've seen the antibodies against Ebola in these bats. And we've also seen in other work, not in our study yet, but we've seen small fragments of Ebola virus, the genetic material. So it's a putative reservoir, meaning nobody has definitively identified the reservoir for many of the Ebola viruses. And so that's why we're continuing to do the work there. And I was looped in at an early stage. I mean, was originally hired more to just sit at the desk, but they're like, go into the field, Sarah, and figure out how to do better data collection. And so this was my first job when I got to WCS, and I was just really fortunate to get on an early stage of this sampling and study, working with hammer-headed fruit bats there in northern Congo, and they're just fascinating species.
Yeah, tell me about them. I've never hammer-headed fruit bats.
Yeah,
like hammerhead sharks.
Well, imagine a moose head and put on these adorable ears and kind of an Yoda-like expression on their face, and you get to hold them in your hands when we're doing the sampling. I get to hold them for about 15 minutes, and we kind of have a team there that carefully samples them, and then they're released. Their wingspan, if you put your left arm out and your right arm out, can reach a meter across. And they weigh about, the females are coming around 300 grams and the males around 500 grams, so like a really small cat. And the males have, like I said, this huge nose, like think moose. And they congregate around a lek. So it's kind of like this mating arena. And that's where we sample again, because we can get good, reliable numbers of bats when we use our mist nets. And the bats make this honking noise to attract the females. And so you're sampling under this canopy of trees, and this honking noise is just raucous at times. And it doesn't keep us up at night because we're working at night. We're already awake. But when you fall asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's just this cacophonous kind of echoing and so they make this one sound, and it's a kind of like the call-in sound, and then they shift the call when they're performing for a female, like a female's close by. So you can kind of just, in your head, you're imagining what's going on in the trees above you as you sleep. But it's a really a special place.
So I'm curious, you mentioned that there's only a putative reservoir, in that it's not really established yet exactly where or exactly what organisms are holding on to this Ebola virus and potentially spilling it over. But you've been studying these bats for quite some time, and that they carry it, right?
Yeah, the studies point to the fact that you can find these, small genetic pieces of the virus, and we can see that they've been infected because we can see that there's antibodies there. But yeah, nobody has, gone back and fulfilled Koch's postulates when it comes to Ebola virus. That is, sampling an animal.
What? How do we know, kind of for a fact? Like, what is sort of the smoking gun here?
Yeah, so to kind of get the smoking gun, you need to isolate the virus from the free-ranging species that you're targeting. In this case, we're looking at, different bat species in Africa. You need to isolate the virus and then pass it through culture, which is hard to begin with because, we don't have a lot of bat cell cultures out there. And then from that cell culture, reinfect a bat species and and show that it infects that bat species.
I see. So you've got to be able to isolate live virus, show that you can have this virus live outside of the species, and then reinfect it almost in like a laboratory version of a spreading of the disease in the wild.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, with some of these viruses that bats carry that can cause so much sickness in people, they don't appear to cause any sickness in bats. So the people have tried to infect bats in laboratory settings, and the bats act as if nothing's happened. So we're still on track, on the hunt for exactly how these viruses infect bats and why their immune systems don't seem to be as susceptible to these viruses as people.
Right, but wouldn't that actually be a kind of a discerning feature of a good animal reservoir, in that it carries
Exactly.
an infection without dying from it?
Well, exactly. And we think, just as, it seems to hide in people is what we're learning in these most recent outbreaks, where does it hide in bats? And figuring that out is a big ask. It's taking us a long time to figure out human immunology, but the eyes are on, and the attention of different scientists are focused on understanding bat immunology now. And hopefully in the coming years, we'll have some more knowledge of exactly how that works. But it seems to be working differently than people. So there's this trade-off, kind of, what the host does to defend itself from an attacking virus, and what a host can do to kind of tolerate a virus. And for bats, the balance seems to be more on the tolerance side, which is different than how our bodies respond. We have this huge inflammation response, a fever response. Bats, not so much.
Right, right. Yeah. And I mean, this is a pretty deadly disease if and when humans do contract it, although not everybody dies when they get Ebola. It can be quite survivable, but if you do get sick enough to get to that phase where the hemorrhagic fever sets in, you are you're in a lot of pain. You're really showing some severe symptoms.
Yeah, fortunately, there are some vaccines for people now, and they're doing a really good job. DRC is just impressive in their ability to get in the field and start doing ring vaccinations when there are outbreaks now. And, hats off. I think a big awareness for those vaccines was due to the 2014 Ebola outbreak that was in West Africa. And from our side, it's still a threat. We know, and the reason, why is WCS, conservation organization, interested in a human health issue like Ebola? Well, it turns out it's also an issue for great apes. When this first spilled over in the early 2000s, we saw really high mortality, around 96% in populations that were being observed. So we had eyes on these kind of wet marshes in knowing individual gorillas, and they noted 96% declines in these populations.
Ugh.
And so that's another
already
reason.
an endangered species that's so threatened.
Yeah. So these Western rolling gorillas are the populations are sustainable, but if something moves through, in addition to other threats with reducing habitat and so forth, we as a conservation organization also have an interest in keeping our eyes on how this impacts and could threaten great apes moving forward.
Yeah, you mentioned that these sort of gorilla populations are somewhat balanced now, but I can imagine that they're significantly smaller than they have been in the past.
And we haven't seen these in the mountain gorillas, fortunately. Fingers crossed.
The
mountain gorillas are a different subspecies, and
those are the ones in like Uganda, Rwanda that are only
those
sort of in the Virunga. Yeah.
Yep. So those are on our radar considerably for risks. One of the things we have been doing in Republic of Congo is working with community members. And this started up again in the mid 2000s after those initial outbreaks, asking what can we do both for human health, but also for conservation. And we developed kind of an outreach program that sends our teams to the communities and talks with them about what to do when you find a dead carcass. And so that's how that's how the outbreaks were happening in the 2000s. People were encountering carcasses and consuming meat they found dead. And that meant that, these communities just didn't have the right information. So sharing that information, saying, hey, if you find something dead in the forest, give us a call. Don't touch, don't move it or anything. And we have a response team that comes in and samples those carcasses and then reports back and says, no, it was negative. Unfortunately, all of those carcasses we've tested going back now are negative. And so it's a way to kind of benefit both. And it's really in the spirit of One Health, information that benefits human health and conservation initiatives.
Absolutely. Yeah. I guess the idea being that it seems like an easier source of calories, as if another animal had taken it down, but really it likely fell because of disease. And that's, quite dangerous to human health, especially because we are genetically so similar to great apes. And there's a lot of potential for spillover infections with great apes, as we've seen with HIV/AIDS, as we've seen with Ebola, as we've seen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and it opens up our ability to understand what's going on as well with, if we diagnose, okay, it's not Ebola, but we can get in there and get more samples and better understand what might be causing a die-off in great apes.
Gosh, I can imagine that work when you're there, boots on the ground, as opposed to being in the lab looking at samples, looking at blood samples, looking at things under the microscope. But when you're there, boots on the ground, working with, especially, working with bats is one thing. I think there's obviously potential risks, but there's also excitement, and there's, it must be thrilling. But working with great apes, is there not like a deeper sort of sadness when you do encounter, a felled animal? They're so much like us, and I think that we have a very strong emotional reaction when we encounter these sort of like genetic cousins.
No, it's really moving. And I've had the fortunate opportunity to spend some time with our programs that are doing research with habituated populations of great apes. And it is really moving to be sitting still in a forest and to be seeing the expressions on their face and just even gestures that you see, in society and people using, those same gestures and the care that they show for the young, um, is really, really moving. And, being based in the US, I'm more of a support position, but I was on hand for a time when we responded to a carcass, great ape carcass that we were sampling. And I think, what I wasn't ready for was the sound. I think I heard it first. It was just the flies there's such a congregation of flies. That was the first sound that struck me. And then the smell, even being, we remained a good safe distance away. We have a whole protocol to keep the sampler safe that we've worked out with partners at the NIH to make sure we're following best practices. So the primary concern when you're arriving is just to keep yourself safe, and then just these are large animals when they do die, and making sure that we carefully and safely sample them. And it's seeing those species in the wild is always incredible, and it's unfortunate when we have to sample them under less, when they're dead for these reasons, but it's nonetheless still really a moving experience.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, it's an animal carcass. And yes, most of us have experience with species that are, native to where we live. And so we're used to seeing, animals that have died. But it's true, a great ape, it's a body. Like when you encounter it, it must feel a lot more like what would happen if you encountered a dead human in the wild, and that would be, incredibly, I think, affecting. At the same time, I wonder if this speaks to a larger issue that I'm sure you've encountered, and I'm curious about your take on, which is our emotional reaction and response to things that look like us, to things that have faces, to things that are furry, to things that are warm and, complex, from a sort of biological body plan perspective, that we tend to want to protect the elephants and the apes and the, big fuzzy charismatic megafauna, more than perhaps the bats or the insects or the other forms of biodiversity that are, equivalently important to the greater ecosystem, but we don't have this sort of human relationship with.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because I wasn't a bat person at first. And I think that's one thing about the hammer-headed fruit bat is the hammer-headed fruit bat's a great, like, charismatic bat species because it brings people in. You look at that species and it just pulls you in. Unlike, I've worked with the North American bats on threats that they're facing due to white nose syndrome, and a colleague of mine has, done some work on, how people respond to images of bats. And you go to a human health web page on, your local resources and to talk about rabies and those threats. And the bats have their teeth are bared and they look really scary and they look so foreign. Flip side, you go to a page from your local Department of Wildlife, whatnot, and talks about white nose syndrome and the threats to bats that they're facing. And there, you get these more cuddly images. The teeth aren't bared as much; they're much more kind of neutral photos, and how different sectors view bats differently is just one example in this space. And finding a way to blend both of those messaging. Yes, bats carry rabies, so we need to be careful and alert for when you have come into contact with a bat, or a bat has come into contact with you. We don't want anybody dying from a preventable disease like rabies. But on the other hand, we also need to take steps to protect these species that are being encroached on by a fungal disease that apparently we introduced, climate change, which is altering their habitats, reduced habitat, reduced wetlands, a huge drop in insect biodiversity for reasons still we can kind of fuzzily explain, but really no solid this is the silver bullet. And to find kind of some harmony there, so that we're looking at bats for what they are, but not over I don't know how to say this, like that we're not overcompensating one way or the other. That it's not just a human health threat. It's not we don't want to be cuddling up to these species either, but we need to find a way to live together. And so
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of like a bigger, the larger issue at hand, and it kind of try and follow me for a second because I'm going to a lot of different places in my mind. But I'm thinking back to a lot of guests that I've had on my show in the past, and of course I had like Merlin Tuttle on the show, and he's like a bat evangelist, right? So he's like, don't hate on the bats; they always hate on the bats. So that was kind of nice, having that perspective on. But then I've also had individuals like my dear friend Beth Pratt from the California Wildlife Federation, or Wildlife, oh gosh, is it Federation, California Wildlife Society? I think it's Federation. And she really is responsible for sort of giving our local mountain lion who lives in Griffith Park, P22, like a personality. Like she gave him a Facebook page, and, he's the lonely bachelor, and he's sort of this story of what happens when you cross multiple freeways and can't get out, and all about, and so she's taught a lot of these bigger, important issues through this sort of character that is this big cat. And early on, she got a lot of hate from a lot of scientists for like really personifying this animal. But we also see what amazing good it's done. She's raised multi-millions of dollars for a wildlife crossing here in Los Angeles. And it sort of speaks to this difficulty of trying to strike a balance. The other thing I'm reminded of is a woman who I had on my show named Jo Ruxton, who was a producer on Blue Planet and worked really hard on this film, and then later was having a lot of kind of regret about the fact that she was involved in making this beautiful movie that showed the oceans as this like stunning yet pristine place. And she was like, that's not what it looked like when we were down there filming. This is very creative editing to show you guys a sort of aspirational view of the ocean. And it led her to then work on a film called A Plastic Ocean, because she wanted to show sort of the other side of that story. And I think it's something we all struggle with in both science work, but also on the other side of that, the science communication and the evangelization of science is like, how do we strike a balance between being aspirational and sort of being cheerleaders and promoters of science, but at the same time being critical, turning our eye inward and seeing where we're making mistakes, and being honest about the tragedies that are happening, across the globe. Like, and in conservation, that's a hard balance to strike, because like the work can feel very heavy and very depressing.
Yeah, I think anthropomorphizing, of course, can make wildlife very relatable. It's a great way to tell stories. It's also interesting, riffing off of your expansion, there's a thing about who is telling the stories.
Mm-hmm,
I think a lot of the stories are coming from scientists who are privileged and have, received STEM education. And there's a lot of stories that aren't being told in this space. I think that's something to think about. It does just come down to making wildlife, making, as we started out, making your understanding to where you are in the space and the actions that you're taking and the actions we need to take as a society. Some of these solutions aren't going to be solved by individual actions. They need to take societal steps. They need bigger cultural shifts and changes to these global challenges that we're facing. And you need to have you need to have that connection. And that starts with storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's true. Savvy storytelling has an understanding. Well, savvy science communication has an understanding, A, that humans respond to stories, and B, there has to be a certain level of sort of social psychology that's involved in the storytelling. Like, how do humans respond to stories? How do we initiate action? How do we get people to care? And if you don't really utilize that savvy, sadly, a lot of these stories are going to fall on deaf ears.
Yeah. And then it's that translating that individual buy-in to collective action, to social and cultural change. And I mean, it can start, like you pointed your example of the cougar in Los Angeles. There's, efforts to, track individual whales in the New York seascape and in Patagonia. It allows some of those initial kind of on ramps to some of these ideas. I don't think we've got that conversion there yet. I think people are trying to figure out how to get there, and big climate initiatives and outreach like COP and things like that. There needs to be some sort of middle ground there. I don't know what that is yet, but that between individual and some of these larger multilateral kind of actions that are moving in the right direction. But we need that mid-level kind of conversion as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I completely agree. And it's you're right. It's a difficult balance, but it's, one that we can aspire to. And I think it's one that obviously scientists across the globe, including yourself, are aspiring to, especially within the conservation space. There's something that you brought up earlier that I wanted to make sure I didn't forget. I took a little note and wrote it down, that you mentioned the global wildlife trade and how that has become a sort of a part of your overarching work is understanding the global wildlife trade, the human wildlife interactions that occur throughout the global wildlife trade. And I'm curious, like, what are some of your insights that you've made, some of the the problems that you've seen, some of the potential solutions in front of us?
Yeah, and I'll take this back to kind of the zoonotic space, which is where I've been more focused. And we've done a lot of work, of course, on illegal wildlife trafficking across WCS, but my little niche is working on these zoonotic disease angles. We had a study that came out this last year that looked at live wildlife trade system. This system was in rats in the lower Mekong region, so like southern Vietnam, Cambodia, and that region. And we were able to do some sampling along the supply chain. So, not just at markets where a lot of focus has been put. And recently in April, I think it was, the World Health Organization put out kind of a release saying, to clamp down on spillover risk, we really need to focus on markets, which is a great starting point. But one thing our work showed was that the prevalence of detection rates. So let's just take one family of viruses. And we focused on coronaviruses, but usually a free-ranging rodent anywhere around the world, your chance of detecting a coronavirus, and again, these aren't SARS-CoV-2 viruses, these are just run-of-the-mill coronaviruses that we don't know anything if they most likely don't cause human health issues. They're just kind of, the coronaviruses that are out there.
Right. It's a big umbrella. Like even the ones that cause human health issues, it's not just COVID. Like there's a certain portion of the common cold is caused by coronaviruses.
It's just there's a few that we don't know. So it's a big net. We're casting a big net here. And that's around 2% of, any rodent that you sample would probably come up with a coronavirus. When we started sampling along the supply chain, we looked at rat traders kind of in the initial kind of phase of the supply chain. Then we looked at large markets, and then we looked at restaurants. And what we found was kind of typical textbook disease ecology, what you expect to find when you mix together different species, different, populations, and you put them under stressful conditions in cages, very unnatural conditions. But those rat traders, we saw about 21% of the rats were positive for coronavirus. The large market, 32%. By the time the rodents were slaughtered just before they were served in the restaurants, over 50% or 57% of the rodents that we were sampling, we were picking up coronaviruses. So it showed this amplification of how we're mixing animals, live animals in particular, and how their susceptibilities, their immune systems are compromised. They're shedding feces and urinating on each other. How these processes can amplify coronaviruses, which in nature are really low levels typically, to some pretty substantial prevalences. And so I was blown away by that. And when we put that story together, I was like, really? I mean, I was expecting to see something, but to the extent that it was over 50% was really astonishing. And it speaks to, I think, paying attention to not just markets, but everything that happens along kind of these supply chains. And we know, for example, there's a big trade in live pangolins that move into Southeast Asia as well. And there's connections from work done in China on some rescue centers in pangolins where we know they're carrying some viruses that are not SARS-CoV-2, but are somewhat, near relatives. And that just speaks to, how some of these activities for the commercial trade not only bring people into contact with wildlife. So that's the first risk factor. But the process itself is potentially amplifying viruses because of the conditions of the trade itself. And then a third way is you get mixing. So you bring a population from one location and another population. You're going to be having the potential to, have two different viruses infect one cell in that animal. And that's where we get, new genetic mixes of viruses and, these rearrangements and reassortments that can happen and create, new viruses completely. So there's a lot of, I think, work to be done on wildlife trade. And a lot of the work that we've done, I think, is showing the risk involved, especially with the commercial live wildlife trade. And needs considerable attention. And that's another space I think we can start to act now, where wildlife isn't necessarily being used for subsistence, for nutrition needs, where it's being sold for luxury. This is a trade-off. I think that's not a trade-off, but this is a decision that should be pretty easy to make.
Yeah. I remember once speaking with Rebecca Atencia, who is one of the lead veterinarians at the Chimpango Wildlife Preserve, and talking to her about chimpanzee meat, basically, people who are consuming chimpanzee and what the situation is there. And I was trying to be really sensitive. And so I remember saying something along the lines of, from a Western perspective, we don't understand the pressures obviously on the ground, and, it may be difficult to communicate, not consuming these kinds of calories. And I remember her saying something along the lines of yes, there are examples where, an animal falls in the forest and like you mentioned, people may scavenge the animal, but she was like, poor people generally are not eating chimpanzee. She was like, this is a luxury item. That's not the issue at play here. Chimpanzee is being traded for, people with means in order to fulfill certain needs, in order to fulfill certain ideas about, it's like a status symbol, consuming chimp meat. And so you're right, there are these examples, or traditional Chinese medicine examples, where these things are being traded for their, potential sort of, and I'm putting this in quotes, benefit to the individual that is not there to just serve basic caloric needs. And that's a sad truth.
Yeah. And it comes back to with your example of Chinese medicine, in much of that trade, you see a lot of movement of pangolin scales, and the pangolin scale market's incredible. They talk about pangolin scales in terms of tons, which every time I hear that unit, it makes me pause. But the whole process of moving pangolins to the point where they are processed is also bringing, people and pangolins into unnecessary contact. And there's a lot that needs to be done in that space. And the pangolin trade is just really unfortunate.
Oh God, it's horrifying. It reminds me a little bit of I rewatched at the very beginning of COVID because I don't know, I guess I'm a masochist. I was like, oh, I'm going to watch Contagion. I'm home alone. I'm doing nothing. I'm going to watch Contagion. And I think a lot of people did that. It was actually like trending on Netflix. And so for anybody who remembers the film, there were a lot of things that were really prescient in Contagion, of course, because they had science advisors who are like, working in the epidemiology space. And they're like, this would happen, that would happen, that would happen. There are other things that are ludicrous, like nobody at the CDC was like wearing masks. I'm like, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. Like it was like so much worse than COVID in terms of infection rates. Yet everybody's like, not wearing a mask inside. But anyway, we'll ignore that. What I loved about the film is that at the very, very end, there's this very quick, blink and you'll miss it. It's like a 30-second montage of patient zero and how she got to be patient zero. And it shows like the bat flying, pooping in the farm area, the pigs, sniffling it, the butcher picking up the pig. And it like goes chain by chain by chain of how the spillover event happened until it finally reaches the chef and then reaches the woman who's, the chef shook hands with after he had been like handling this infected pork. And it's really cool to see a kind of cinematic synthesis of a spillover event, because I don't think we often think in those terms of like, a lot of things have to happen in order for a disease to spill over, yet we are making a prime situation for that because we're taking species that never would have interacted in the wild and we're putting them in close contact.
Yeah, that scene from the very end of Contagion sticks with me too. And it's a useful, kind of like, do you remember the end of Contagion where this happened?
Yeah, right.
This is what we're talking about, that example follows Nipah virus pretty well, where the bats were infecting the pigs and they had this amplifying host in the pigs, and then it went on. But we've seen, even since that movie, I think we've seen MERS emerge, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is bats to camels to people. SARS was bats to civets or raccoon dogs in the trade. One of the other things we found in that paper on the rodents, another thing we shared was, that these places where wildlife is farmed are not secure. So, where wildlife is farmed in Vietnam, bats can fly over. It's not like chickens in the United States where they're all contained in a big roof scenario. So there's a lot of potential for contamination, like you see in Contagion with wildlife trade. And yeah, it's just the mixing of all these species. And we've seen example, like we've seen, SARS-CoV-1, where we know it was raccoon dogs and civets. We know it was linked to the trade there. We know with mares, it came through bats and then it came through camels. And now a lot of interesting information is coming out on COVID. Just last week they found some really closely related viruses in bats in northern Laos or Cambodia. I can't recall which, but so there's lots of, we don't have the smoking gun, but the more we look, the more we're finding.
Yeah. I remember even personally, might have been 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, when I visited Hong Kong and southern China, not in Hong Kong per se, but when we drove into southern China, and really I spent a few days in sort of like the Dongguan region of southern China, and I visited a market. My friends who I was there with, my colleagues were like, hey, there were locals in China, and they were like, hey, do you want to come to like a kind of a classic Chinese market? And I remember seeing all of the really fresh produce, and it was like amazing. And then some of the unique species that unique to us here in the West, that are consumed, live frogs and things like that. But I do remember walking on the outside of the market at one point and seeing things like dog meat and things that were like really confusing to me, but also, grappling with sort of my personal emotions about that and trying to really maintain a global perspective. And so that's one thing when you're seeing all of the meat hanging and, you can purchase the meat just like you would see at a butcher here. But then, going around back and being like, that's a lot of birds in cages. A lot of live birds that are all different species that are in open cages that are just stacked next to each other. And then there's a bucket of frogs right next to it. And there's a big cage full of turtles right next to that. And like, I remember being like, this is how global infections start. Like I'm looking at these cages and thinking to myself, that species and that species would never have come in contact in the wild. And if they carry anything that is remotely infectious to one another, then it has the chance to mutate and multiply and potentially spill over to like this is what zoonotic spillover is. Like I'm watching it.
You're watching it in presence of it happening potentially. Yeah, I mean, we talked about how many layers there are, for spillover to happen, and there's been some great work done by Raina Plowright and colleagues, kind of showing the Swiss cheese model of all of these different barriers, and if the holes are all lined up, each layer of Swiss cheese, you can kind of see how, when everything lines up, you can get something that drops through. But in this case, we're just adding holes to the Swiss cheese. Like we're blowing apart like these barriers where we're mixing species. We're bringing in the potential for mutations, like you point out, when one animal is infected with two different viruses. It's really an unhealthy way to manage, a commercial, something that's being done mostly for luxury in these large markets in China. And so there's an important kind of consideration there, trading off what's thought to be, I think, $1 billion industry in China, but here we have maybe a couple $1 trillion on the side of pandemic prevention pandemic cost.
Wow. Yeah. It's interesting to think about the sheer numbers and like, the sort of adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it just seems to always work out that way, doesn't it? Like when you really start to add it up, it's like, good God, when things start to kind of spin out of control, the cost involved is just astronomical compared to the cost that it would take if governments would just step up and basically put their nickel down on these prevention efforts. And that must be a frustrating thing working in the conservation space, that a big part of what you guys have to do is literally fundraise a bit. That's why so many conservation organizations are NGOs. It's why so many conservation organizations are struggling financially, because I don't know if the political will is always there for this kind of work, even though it's basically fundamental to our survival.
Yeah. It's a hustle. We're hustling now, for example, to work to establish national wildlife health surveillance systems. You look at the World Bank report, and they got feedback from about 8 countries, and those 8 countries said, we're spending about $50,000 a year on wildlife health surveillance.
What?
It's not a lot.
That's banana. That's nothing.
It is nothing. And another report just went through and looked at national plans and documents and said about 80% or more of national systems for wildlife health surveillance either don't exist or they need improvement. So there's a huge space here, I think, and another opportunity. If there's political will, which hopefully, following COVID, if that's, one thing that can come of this is, political will to do something, then we can start building up some national wildlife health systems that work with partners in the livestock sector, that work with partners in the human health sector. And so we can have this information flowing and monitoring, eyes in the field. If there's a die-off of civets in a rescue center, or a die-off of pangolins on in a market, that we would have an awareness of these things that are going on, but also some eyes in the ears of just what's happening. Passive surveillance is useful at this stage as well. Similar to what we're doing in Congo. When something dies in the woods, let's go figure out what happened there and learn from it, and use that information to improve surveillance systems for One Health and to kind of tighten up these systems so that we don't have these gaps.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Sarah, gosh, there's so much more that we could dive into, but I know we're getting close to hitting that hour point, and I don't want to keep you for too long. Before we sort of move on to my closing segment, I'm wondering if there's anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to make sure was said, especially since you have a captive audience right now.
Yeah, I mean, I was able to mention the wildlife health trade work, which I think is really important, and it is a hustle. We're really struggling. It falls in this gap where there's attention and great, funding resources for human health surveillance. I think now, especially because we're tracking all of the human COVID-19 cases. There's an established, system for livestock health in many countries. And we're trying to make a pitch to show that there's this gap, but there's also, we know how to do this. We've been working on implementing a system in a couple lower middle income countries in Southeast Asia, and we're making progress. And it's hard to make that transition. Like it's a sustainability thing. Like we can bring in the funding, outside funding and support, like grants and contracts to build up something, but it is hard for countries to integrate this into their policy framework, into their governmental framework, and it's hard to do that with just a 3-year funding cycle, right? Like let's go build national wildlife health surveillance that's integrated and do it in 3 years and walk away and we're done. No, I mean it takes longer term investments, and a lot of times that those investments, just donors aren't able to do that. So it's a rock and a hard place, but there are opportunities here, and hopefully some more attention can be brought to this space with more awareness of these gaps. I think that's something that folks just don't understand. I think we here in the U.S., like, oh yeah, we have wildlife health systems in the states, and at a national level, it's there. It's kind of taken for granted, but really beyond many, even the U.S., Canada, a couple countries in Europe, there's really not a lot of support for wildlife health surveillance currently.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. It's such an important area to keep our focus on. So Sarah, listen, before we go, I always ask my guests the same 2 questions, and I'm curious about your responses, especially given that you spend so much of your time in this space. So they're sort of big picture questions. Are you ready for them? All right. So when you think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you, so it could have to do with your work, it could have to do with yourself personally, it could be, an individual to a national, to a global, or even a cosmic perspective. So you can take this wherever you want. The first question is, what is the thing that is keeping you up the most at night? The thing that you are most concerned about, worried about? Perhaps it's even venturing into like pessimism or cynicism territory. But then on the flip side of that, to sort of end on a more, obviously hopeful note, where are you finding your optimism these days? Where are you genuinely and authentically, like not lip service, not saccharine, like where are you actually finding your hope?
Keeps me up at night is the threat of the next spillover, that we're not going to catch it, that we already have so many threats in the next 10 to 20 years between climate change, biodiversity loss, all of these factors. We don't need another spillover event, and we have the tools to prevent spillover if we choose to act, on the commercial trade, where we've seen SARS-CoV-1, SARS-CoV-2 emerge. I think that would be just gut-wrenching, because as a conservation organization looking at this for the last 20 some plus years, where we have the knowledge and understanding of what contributes to spillover, that would be an easy win. And that keeps me up at night, that we can't move fast enough, that we can't get these systems in place quick enough, that we can't implement wildlife health surveillance fast enough. So that's kind of those are the big threats. And then the bigger threats down the road are just climate change and biodiversity loss, and navigating to a space where we have sustainability of humans, livestock, ecosystems, for future generations. And that's the big goal. And I think we have some easy. We can't have another can't have another outbreak get in our way of achieving those goals. There's already enough to deal with the pandemic that we're currently in, and as we see now, the new variants that are coming out, this is going to be with us for some time. And the hope is the same side of that. Like we do know what actions we can take. We can stop the commercial trade in items that are just flowing to these luxury markets, and we can do that in sensitive ways. We can use different approaches, but let's get moving on it now. And I am hopeful. Like we can get there. I think we've got ourselves this far. We can dig ourselves back out. And I'm really, every day I get to work with some amazing colleagues that are just as passionate, and that gives me the hope. There's a lot of other organizations out there that are also, doing really good work, and, combine our forces. And that's the other cool thing about One Health. We bring these sectors together. We're stronger together than we are, working apart in our silos. And I know we can get there. We just have to keep digging in and finding those solutions and building on the wins that we identify.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to sort of alert us or re-alert us and engage us with this, massive problem, but also show us that there is hope and that there are, incredible people working on solutions and, thinking about our global health and the global health of the ecosystem of the planet. Thank you for the work that you do and for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, and just to point out, if listeners are interested, there's a Protect Wildlife, Protect Us campaign that folks can look up at wcs.org, and that kind of I think is in the same vein of my closing statement there. We really need to protect the earth, protect wildlife, and that will benefit by protecting us and future generations.
Absolutely. Protect wildlife, people. Go there and see how you can help. Thank you so much once again. And to everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.